Grazie ancora Angela. Allora, a questo punto abbiamo piccole operazioni tecniche perché grazie sempre alla Fara, alla perfetta, efficientissima organizzazione della Fara, abbiamo anche una traduzione simultanea che adesso ci aiuterà a seguire e invito Arne e Focke del Museo Openheim di Hirkheim a prendere posto e illustrarci. Siamo di concludere queste giornate appunto con questa esposizione perché riassume perfettamente due delle essenze di queste giornate: la importanza della rianimazione, della rievocazione storica in cui noi crediamo molto e l'apertura verso le esperienze straniere. Speriamo che questa sia, e anticipo poi i saluti finali, un primo appuntamento all'interno del museo in collaborazione con la Fara della sezione convegnistica. Speriamo che non sia ovviamente l'ultimo. E uno dei nostri obiettivi è quello ogni anno, condiviso con i ragazzi della Fara, di invitare altre esperienze e fare in modo che a Cividale, con spero un afflusso maggiore di cividalesi soprattutto, si possano godere e fruire esperienze diverse che in maniera differente sarebbe abbastanza complicato raggiungere. Thank you very much, Arne.
Okay, before I really start, a few words in advance. If any of you have questions during my lecture, you can ask me at any time. Just try to get my attention and I can get right to you. I've got all my lecture right here, so you don't have to be afraid to get me off track. When we talk about shoes in the Middle Ages, we talk about a 1,000-year time frame, and that's quite a bit of shoe development, as you can imagine. So we won't be able to cover everything in that. The only thing I can do is give you a short glimpse into those kind of shoes and what they can teach us today about people in medieval times. Shoemakers in the early Middle Ages still continued to apply techniques that were already developed during the Iron Age or also the Roman period, including the patterns for the shoes. An example of that can be seen here on top. From that, we go down to an example of about the 12th century, where the patterns are more fully developed, and also during the course of the Middle Ages, it goes on to shoes like this who have multi-layered soles, which are kind of the predecessor to our modern-made shoes. And me as an archaeologist, my goal is to decipher every aspect of everyday life back then. And it may not at first seem plausible why such a simple object like a shoe holds so much interest for me. And I just hope I can show you why. In fact, shoes are real cornucopia of information, and I will try to show you, beginning with simple information about the materials used, to the techniques applied when making the shoes, and also what shoes can tell us about the individual wearer of a shoe. Starting with materials that were used for shoes, we have to talk about leather and of the properties of leather. Again, even here I can't go into too much detail, there's simply not enough time. That will be part of another lecture I'll be planning to do this winter, but all leathers that are produced are made from animal skin, and virtually every animal skin can be used to make leather. But that always has a direct influence of the quality of the leather, depending on which animal you use or how old the animal was. The goal of a tanner in medieval times was always to stop the skin from rotting and to preserve it for a long time and to keep the properties of the leather intact, which is an arduous process that hasn't quite changed all that much over the turn of the centuries, even up to maybe 100 years ago. The techniques pretty much still stayed the same. Now we take a short look at the structure of the skin. And even the tanner in the Middle Ages knew about that structure, albeit in much lesser detail. He knew that only the corium of the leather could be tanned. This is the layer of the skin that keeps the skin intact, which holds it together. And he also knew that you had to remove the hair layer up there and the fatty subcutaneous layer, because those can't both be tanned. They don't accept the tanning acids. And what the tanner's trying to do is to stabilize the collagen in the skin, which is the part of the skin that starts to rot when too much moisture is applied or when there's not enough moisture. And he tried to keep it intact in a way so the skin can still regulate its own moisture and still stays pliable. What the tanner does can be put together in one simple sentence. Whatever is good or bad for the live skin is also good or bad for the dead one. Just as important as the properties of the materials used is also the terms when we are talking about separate parts of the shoes. Archaeologists these days are often a bit wary about using modern craftsman terms when they talk about parts of archaeological shoes. This always leads to a big jumble of terms. Sometimes terms are used by separate scientists for different things, or they use a term that's already in use by modern craftsmen today, but use it for a completely different thing. I try to avoid that. I still use terms that are used by the craftsmen, but terms that were used for hundreds of years, and so there's no reason why they still can't apply to archaeological shoes. Since we are again talking about a big subject, I will limit myself to those parts of the shoe that are important for our quick overview here. And let's start with parts that gave my lecture its name. The first thing is the vamp, that covers the instep up from the top, up down to the toes. Secondly is the quarter that surrounds the heel area. And it doesn't matter how big a shoe is. If it's a low-cut shoe or a high-cut shoe like a boot, it's still divided into vamp and quarter, and both together are called simply the upper. Clothing the shoe at the bottom is, of course, the sole, which also underwent quite just between the sole and the upper is a rand. It was inserted by the shoemaker to close up minor gaps in the seam. It was made of very soft leather, and also to protect the seam. But shoes of the Middle Ages are almost watertight. I always test that when I make a reconstruction of a shoe. When I'm making it, I fill it with water afterwards to see if I made the seam correctly, because it should be watertight. Again, here I have a little find from the city of Lübeck in northern Germany. And this shoe is a fine example how skilled the shoemaker in the Middle Ages had to be when measuring the boot. Maybe I can go back to the picture before. Right there in the corner you can see a little reinforcement in the heel area. The whole purpose of that thing is to keep the heel from being trodden down. If that part is missing or the shoe is simply too big, a very distinct wrinkle will occur at the heel of the shoe. In this case, the shoe was simply too big, but that shoemaker didn't just make that one shoe. He made shoes, or not just he himself, but also most likely his pupils, made shoes like that for over 50 years, and all were slightly too big. But still he stayed in business, so people mustn't have minded that much. But it's quite unusual for the Middle Ages to have shoes that don't fit properly. This is a find I've worked myself with from the city of Stade in northern Germany, that's close to Hamburg. And as an archaeologist, we always find shoes that are incomplete and also very often heavily patched. And most of those patches are sole patches, which just shows that people in medieval times didn't just throw a shoe away when it was worn. It was repaired over and over again until it couldn't be repaired anymore. And please also pay attention to the shape of the upper leather. It's because of the way the drawing is pointing in the upside down J. That will be important a bit later in my lecture. Before we continue with more details about medieval shoes, I would like to give you a little glimpse of everyday scientific research in this field. Most shoes that we find come from medieval towns, where they are found in sewer pits and cesspits, which means that they are in dire need of cleaning, as you can see here. But it also means that we have, because of that, a pretty good idea what the shoes of the medieval townspeople looked like. Shoe of the more rural community is, however, a bit of a mystery. We don't have that many shoes from rural areas. Other pieces we may find in cesspits, even after cleaning, are not as easy to identify. You can see it looks like it has some nice folds around that hole. Maybe one of you want to try to guess what kind of object we have here. That's also a mean joke on my part, because that's just In order to keep tracks of all their finds, archaeologists put their finds into typologies, into series, so they can put them in a functional order and hopefully also a chronological order. And I just want to show you the most common ones when talking about shoes. The oldest and probably the most well-known typology was made up by a woman from the Netherlands, Groeman van Wateringe, for the finds of the Viking settlement of Haithabu. And her series contains types numbered from 1 to 10, so it was rather short. Types here are defined by technical data such as height of the shoe, position of the seams, and the like. big disadvantage of this series was that it offers no chronological data. So if you want to date the shoe, you have to use the objects found with it. You can't date the shoe all by itself. Grew developed another typology for the finds from London. Her types were defined by construction details like position of the fastenings. But again, no chronological order, which in this case was a huge problem because all those finds from London came from big rubbish heaps at the River Thames. It was used to construct a new harbor alongside. So they just shoveled all the dirt, all the rubbish from the city to the river to make a new harbor, and that's where we found all those shoes could be found. For the material from the city of Schleswig in northern Germany, Schnack developed a series. She used the height of the shoe and the fastening again to define it. But again, she as well offered no chronological data in her series. So why do I keep droning on about no chronological data in a series? Because medieval shoe fashion is very homogeneous. A shoe that was the height of fashion in Switzerland at some point could be just the same just a few years later in London or vice versa. But in these early researches, nobody seemed to realize that. And early researchers sound like it's far, far off, but that work here from Schnack was done in 94, so it's about 20 years ago. It's not that far off. The biggest series developed done by Olaf Gubitz using big find complexes from the Netherlands. And like Grew in London, he separated his types by the fastening method. And for the first time now, he offered a possible dating method by comparing the fastening methods of its series to other constructional details like seam positions and the like. Disadvantage when using with his series is that you have to know the majority of all European shoe finds by heart in order to work with it. He sorted his series in types in steps of 10, starting with 10, going up to 150, so that later on, if new types should develop, they could be inserted later. The newest typology, which just came out last month, was done by Markita Focke. She used the alphabet again to name her types, but this time the shape of the letter described the shape of the upper leather of the shoe. Remember the letter J I've shown you from the shoe before? That means that this shoe is of a type J, made up by Markita Focke. And along with all her types, she introduced various subtypes and families sorted by constructional details, which allowed dating sometimes as accurate below 20 years. And this is the first time we can actually date medieval shoes just by themselves. You could say this is also the first time the homogeneity of medieval shoe finds is actually put to good use. For a more practical approach, like the reenactors at the historical camp do, so much gray theory is only of limited interest, but it's really helpful in judging the skill and the skill of the medieval shoemaker. The most important thing to remember when making a medieval shoe is that almost all medieval shoes are turn shoes. That means They are sewn together inside out, and once they are finished, then they were turned to the correct form. So, if we take a look at a medieval last the shoemaker used to make those shoes, there's several differences to a modern last. Medieval lasts were made from one single wooden block. This one is a bit of a hybrid. It's of the right shape for a medieval last, but it's made of two parts, so it's easier to pull it out of the shoe. The medieval shoemaker didn't do that. He just one wooden block and had to figure out how to get that out of a shoe again. Maybe that's probably the reason why the shoe I've shown you from Lübeck is a bit too big. It made it easier to remove the last. Also, a big difference to a modern last is that the medieval last is completely flat at the bottom, because medieval shoes have no raised heel. Modern last looks a bit more like that to make room for a raised heel. Also, a medieval last, if we look at it, looks a bit closer in mimicking the shape of a foot and the exact measurements of the foot, but it really doesn't. It's slightly bigger than the foot it's made for. That's because medieval shoes are turn shoes, and when we turn them, that the right side gets in, they get a little bit smaller, and the medieval shoemaker has to take that into account in order for the shoe to fit. And again, such craftsmanship isn't just simple guesswork. It's very precise measurement. If it's not precise measurements, we are with that shoe again, which doesn't fit properly. Let me get into some more constructional details, starting with the sole seams. Up here we have early medieval sole seams. The first two examples are from shoes that were just made from one single piece of leather, like this one. There's just one piece of leather wrapped around the foot. But during the course of the early Middle Ages, a separate sole was introduced to make the shoes more durable. Again, later on in the Middle Ages, that trend using a separate sole continued, but the rand I spoke about earlier was inserted in the seam to make that more durable as well. And that did go on to the late Middle Ages. The rand was in most cases just getting longer and then used to attach a second sole. The reason for the invention of second soles, you can see how that was done also here. I explain a bit later. This is an example done by Olaf Hrubitz, how the upper seams that finally closes the shoe could be done. As you can see, there's quite a bit of different methods how it could be done. Also methods how reinforcements to the shoe could be added to make, example here, the lace holes more durable. There's also many examples of decorations that could be used on shoes. Sometimes we have seams that are purely decorational, they don't hold anything to the shoe. Sometimes there's very intricate knotwork. We have punches, we have incisions, and we have cuts in the shoes. But again, there's such a wide variety of decorations, it's impossible to explain that just in half an hour. Now, one of my favorite pictures is the pictures with the fastenings. That would make an impossible long boot. Up here is the early Middle Ages with simple tie lace fastenings going down to becoming more and more intricate till we reach almost modern-looking laces. In the late Middle Ages, also simple little buckles were introduced to close the shoe. So why, as an archaeologist, do I spend so much time on the research of historical shoes and building reconstructions like that? Trustworthy, I can't take credit for these because these were done by Focke. I do that simply because of the many insights shoes offer into the daily life of medieval people. First, there's data it offers on groups of people. So the most simple data you can get from a shoe is, of course, its size. So if you have a big shoe find from a town where you have several hundreds or thousand pieces, you can measure all their shoe sizes and then compare that percentage-wise how many male, female, or juvenile wearers you have in that part of town. Of course, there's slight insecurities. There's women with big feet and men with small feet, so you have to take that into account, but you get approximately an idea what the population of the time looked like. Also, sometimes there was the fashion of very elongated toes, which make the shoe look ridiculously big. And because of that, the researcher on historical shoes measures the imprint of the foot that is still left in the leather. So in most cases, when you have shoe finds like that, you can still actually see the imprint of the toes and of the heel, and then measure quite reliable the shoe size. Also, later on, I will get again to the imprints of the shoes, which leave very remarkable traces that teach you something about the wearer, which can also be explained in one little sentence. Focke said to me once, "Show me your shoe and I tell you what life you lead." Earlier, I've shown you an example of all the different kinds of decorations around the Middle Ages. And just like today in the Middle Ages, many decorations on something probably meant that the wearer was wealthy. This is also very true for the Middle Ages. If you look at a shoe like that, the shoemaker's working time wasn't expensive in the Middle Ages, so all the effort and all the time he put into it was really cheap, but the materials he used wasn't. So sometimes for decorational themes he may have used gold thread, which was of course expensive. Or in this example, there's so many cut holes in the shoe that the upper leather of that shoe wouldn't last very long. So if you have a shoe like that, it's highly decorated with so many holes, you just end up buying more and more shoes. At the site Am Sand in the city of Stade, many highly decorated leather objects, including shoes, were found. This piece here is from a pattern that, in this case, an indoor pattern that was worn to protect the actual shoe. This was made from brocaded silk, so very expensive material. And if we look closely at the find place and see all those decorated shoes, we get the impression that here in this area, here lived the rich and wealthy, or at least they discarded their trash here. And during all those finds, I've worked with those finds myself. We see a gradual change in the quality of the finds. You can see so that this area of town isn't as wealthy anymore as it used to be. So over time, it slowly changes. So shoe finds offer us a kind of micro-history of this part of town. I also told you earlier about patched shoes that were worn through. And in most medieval shoes, the sole is worn through at the toe area. So that means medieval people must have walked differently than we do. If you think about how you walk, you always start with the heel and then roll up your foot, which put most of the pressure in the heel area of the foot. So that means the heel area should be damaged. But in most medieval shoes, the toe area is damaged. So that simply means medieval people, especially on hard ground, moved on their toe areas, on the balls of the feet, and that's why the damage is in that part. You can see that we still do that today. If you are barefoot and you walk on hard ground, you also raise on the toe area of your foot. It's simply more comfortable to walk that way. This leads us to the invention of fixing a second sole to the shoe. Now, this comes up in a point of history where finally people are getting to paving the streets of the medieval town. And in paving the streets, the ground gets more abrasive for the shoes. So the shoes are damaged much faster than they used to. So the shoemaker adapted to that and attaching a second sole to it, and thus making the shoe more durable. So if you look at a medieval town and you have no idea at which point in history they started to pave its streets, maybe there's a couple of shoe finds around which show you when a second sole was attached to the shoe, and then you have a general idea when they started to pave the street. And next to these big pictures of history of towns and all that, we also get a lot of data on the individual wearer as well. In addition to her typology, Makita Focke worked on identifying sicknesses of the individual wearer by looking, just as I told you, at the imprint of the foot of the. Is that still visible in the leather? This imprint I've shown you here is a so-called talus varus. The arch of the foot is barely visible, and the toes are almost claw-like. This is a sign of a neuromuscular disease, which means that the wearer most likely was partially lame and walked accordingly, with very short stomping steps. I've got another example for sicknesses. This one looks almost modern. It looks like a modern foot of a young woman who always squeezes her foot in a high-heeled shoe, but of course it isn't. A foot like this is a sign of a deformity of the spine, which causes that the woman is not able to lower her heel anymore. And also noteworthy for maybe younger women in the audience is if you continuously put your foot in a position like that or force your foot in a position like that, there's a really high danger that this works the other way around and you may really damage your spine like that. People with such deformed feet often cut their shoes to remove some pressure on the foot. But for us archaeologists, that really is a nuisance because it makes it very hard for us to identify the shoe we have found. Also, we often have traces on shoes like that from cobblers that are not quite official shoemakers that just repair the shoes. And they make such bad work that it really makes the work of the archaeologist harder to identify every single shoe we have. And I hope I could show you with these few examples how important it is with shoe finds to look at every single shoe, document its data, because only through that, and maybe in some cases, trying out what we found with real practical approach through experiments, maybe find out more about the actual life of medieval people, or sometimes even about the history of the town where the shoe is found. So I thank you for your time. If there's any more questions, I'm happy to answer them, and you may find me later at the historical camp. Thank you.
Thank you Arne, grazie Arne. Anche in questo caso ci sono domande, curiosità. Prego. Quindi insomma io giunto al termine di queste 2 giornate molto intense, ovviamente ribadisco i ringraziamenti, e i ringraziamenti sono in primo luogo ovviamente per l'associazione La Fara, senza la quale, mi ripeto, tutta questa offerta che abbiamo avuto così condensata non ci sarebbe mai stata sostanzialmente. L'input proviene da loro, noi l'abbiamo molto banalmente raccolto. Grazie ovviamente ai relatori che hanno accolto questa nostra richiesta in maniera sempre gentile, calorosa, amichevole, quindi ricordo il professor La Salvia, Vasco La Salvia, Annalisa Giovannini che oggi non è con noi per evidenti problemi di circolazione nelle nostre strade per oggi, quindi Gabriele Zorzi che non è qui ma è al campo storico, Marco Valenti, Caterina Giostra, Angela ovviamente Borzacconi e Arne che appunto ha completato i lavori. Un ringraziamento a voi che ci avete seguito fino all'ultimo minuto e insomma in bocca al lupo per il vostro rientro e per la circolazione delle nostre strade. Grazie a tutti voi. Grazie anche a Jan, ovviamente, preziosissimo traduttore.